Welcome, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
I feel like I should have challenged everyone to bring their best donkey joke. That got Steve's attention.
I don't know Steve well yet, but I know he's got some good donkey jokes. Here, let's see if we can unmute every person. All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jake Harris. I'm one of the cantorial soloists here at Temple Bethel, and we are here for a lunch and learn with Rabbi Michael Birnholz for our third installment. And Michael has been blessing us with some wonderful information, with some beautiful knowledge tied to Tovu, one of our favorite pieces of liturgy here. We've been going with it strong for a couple thousand years now. And I'm just going to turn it over now to Rabbi Michael, who's going to continue to bless us. Bless us. There you go. Bless us like Balaam blessed the people with some beautiful wisdom. So, Rabbi Michael, over to you.
Thank you so much. And again, is it blessing or cursing? And so as we are studying together, if you see me look over to this side, it's just because that's where your pictures are. So I can also look at the text in front of me. And if you have a question or a comment, if you use the chat or if you use the raise hand function, those are good ways of getting your attention. Please feel free to join in. The best of Jewish study is when we're engaged as a community together. I am not the font of all wisdom. There are a lot of stuff I know. There's a lot of stuff I make up as I go along. But the beauty of Jewish study is not that I read a book. It's that I read a book, you read a book, and we sit down and talk about the book together. And it's one of those incredible pieces that you realize with, I've got 3 children, one in their third year at Northeastern, one just began at the University of Florida, and then my son is a sophomore in high school. And it was, whether it was a Marvel movie or a How to Train Your Dragon book, that was always what we did as a family. Is we didn't just consume media or consume content. We sat then to discuss it, talk about it. What are we learning from it? How is it impacting how we move through the world? And so that's what we're doing right now. Is we are looking at this text of Tovu. And the first week we had an opportunity to really talk about it as a biblical text. What is the story from the book of Numbers? Just as a little bit of a refresher, the people of Israel are wandering in the wilderness. They've left Mount Sinai. They're on their way towards Moab, and Moab is just over the Jordan River in what is now Jordan in the Middle East. And Balak, the king of Moab, sees them coming like all kinds of insects coming to defeat him. And so he calls out to Mesopotamia to a non-Jewish prophet named Balaam, and hires him to come curse the people of Israel. And Balaam, as he is on his way, is riding on the back of a donkey. The donkey, not the prophet, sees the angel with the fiery sword. The donkey turns aside, and there's a whole interaction going back and forth between Balaam and the donkey and the angel, where the donkey keeps trying to rescue Balaam. Balaam keeps charging ahead, finally beating the donkey, and the donkey opens up her mouth and she says, "Why are you beating me? I've always taken you along safety. Why don't you think I'm taking you safely now?" And that's when God opens Balaam's eyes and he sees the angel and understands. There's a few other episodes before we arrive at our text, which is Tovu Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkanotecha Yisrael. How beautiful are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. And that has found its way into our morning liturgy. Those lines of, instead of curses, blessings come out. That line finds its way into our morning liturgy. And so that was our second session last week, where we looked at that text in the liturgy. And I'm going to go back through a little bit of that today, just to refresh and to give you a chance to think about it and put it to use. And today my goal is to look at the text of Tovu and some of the other commentary that comes from it. How do we take that text and those values, whether we're sitting in the synagogue or we're out on our way, and use those values to become the best people we can be or create the best world that we can create. So that is kind of our goal for today. As you can see, applying the values of Tovu. And we'll start first with a blessing of study, because this is not a class just so we learn. This is a class for engaging in the divine, for wrestling with words of Torah, and for feeding our souls. Even as some of you are eating, you're feeding your bodies. Please do enjoy, feel free to enjoy lunch, but you're also then having a chance to feed your soul. And so we have this blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign in the universe, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. This is the text. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael. How fair are your dwellings, O Jacob, your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. Some of the things we've started to talk about is what are the tents and what are the dwellings. And last week we had the kind of the different experiences of the text, where we talked about ohalecha being when Israel is moving, because a ohel is a tent, so that is while we're in motion. And mishkan is more of a fixed kind of location. We also talked about ohel being when the temple stood, and mishkan being when the temple was destroyed. Different times, different ways, paradigms for framing this text and how it's talking with us. One of the things I do want to start thinking about is, notice it says Jacob and Israel. And that's something we might get to it today. We'll see how we do time-wise. If not, we will certainly talk about it next week, because it's interesting to me, that space between Jacob and Israel. And so we'll see how we get today, but I just wanted to call attention to you while we're here. These are the verses of the Psalms that are accompanied, that are placed with this text of Tovu in the Siddur. So it's one of the things that happens in the Siddur is you will get tapestries of text, where you will have, here is one text, here's another verse of Psalms, here's a verse from Proverbs, here's a verse that then get woven together into these beautiful tapestries. It's easy to look at the whole big picture and miss the individual threads, where those individual threads might have impact on you. And sometimes it's worth taking a step back, seeing the big picture, and sometimes it's important to go in and see the individual threads that are there. I can give you a great example of that. How many of you know the text of Mi Chamocha? Mi Chamocha ba'elim Adonai. I'm hoping that's the melody that you all sing at Temple Bethel. It's one of the melodies we do sing here up in Vero Beach. Mi Chamocha comes from the Song of the Sea. That's from Exodus 15. There are multiple verses in there from all sorts of different places. There's actually an evening version and a morning version, which, unless you go to evening services and morning services, you might not even realize that there are two different texts. And then there's another line of Adonai Yimloch Leolam Va'ed, which is also from Exodus 15, from this beautiful text of the Song of the Sea. And so these threads get pulled out of Torah or out of Hebrew Bible or of other kinds of places, woven in, and unless you go looking for them, you might miss all of that detail that's there. And one of the things I love cooking. I love the honest answers. I love eating, and so I also enjoy cooking. It's one of the things I say to our young people as we're starting to talk about liturgy, and I compare it to that eating experience. It's one thing to go and eat a piece of meat, and you can have a wonderful experience eating that piece of meat. it becomes a different experience when you realize, wait, that's a piece of brisket. So it's a particular cut of meat and how it's prepared. And wait, oh, here are some of the spices that are on that brisket. Here is how it's prepared. With the more you start to learn about it, you start getting different perspectives, additional information that can actually elevate that whole experience of having a brisket. It is still wonderful to sit down and have some brisket, but whether it's braised brisket or smoked brisket gives you a different level of appreciation. The other thing that happens, and this is really important, and we'll talk about this more next week when we get into some of the musical settings of these texts. My mother makes a wonderful brisket. I actually don't know what her recipe is. Someday I should find out my mother's brisket recipe. But when I have brisket that tastes like my mother's brisket, I have that moment of nostalgia and connection. When I have a different piece of brisket, I might not connect it unless I have some more of that background, and I can differentiate and say, oh, this is a smoked brisket, which, by the way, my father now really enjoys smoking a piece of brisket. This is really cruel to do. I hope all of you are having something good for lunch as I'm sitting here talking, going on, waxing poetic about brisket. But if I have a smoked piece of brisket, if I don't know the differences in preparation or the understanding of how some of those pieces of meat, cuts of meat might be approached differently, I might not connect the smoked brisket with what my mother has done. And so having more context and information allows me to tap into more experiences across a greater set of time with more people because I have more background for it. And so that's part of this also, is to unpack some of these texts to show you some of the roots, to show you some of the words. You might never have thought to look and say, wait a second, here's a text that talks about Jacob in one line and Israel in another. What is the relationship between Jacob and Israel, for example? Or that we have all of these different words for a house of worship. Why is it important to see, excuse me, that there are a connection between those different words? Or, and this is a fun one, my congregation and your congregation, mine is Beth Shalom, and your congregation is Beth El. That Beth is really the word bayit, or house. And there's a few different reasons why it got turned into Beth. But then you start looking for that word bayit in all kinds of different places. And here's a beautiful piece with this translation. Bet Yud Taf, here is the word bayit. And they're really having fun with the language. Va'ani barov chasdecha avo vetecha. Here's the word chesed, and here's the word bayit. And it says, I, through your abundant love, enter your house. Well, chesed is one word for love, and bayit is talking about house. The next text from a different psalm, Adonai ahavti me'on beitecha. I love your temple abode. In English, you see love and house. Here you see love and temple abode. And you've got two different Hebrew words for love. So we can talk about, wait, why is this chesed, which is one type of love? And here is ahava, which is a different concept of love. Here it's talking about your house as your temple. And here is bayit, but it's now translated from house into temple abode. And just starting to listen and look for words you know gives you a little bit more sense of there's more going on in the text. Don't just listen to the Hebrew words, start looking for words you might know. Don't just read the translation, realize that there's Hebrew, more language going on. So this is that text, and this is some of the things we'll be getting into between this week and next week. And if you have any questions as I'm saying this, please feel free to ask. As we enter our study, I wanted to come back to this today because this is one that I I've got to find a way to put this out because I think on our campus, because I think there's something really powerful about getting people to stop, especially now that we've been out of buildings in a lot of ways. As we are coming back into buildings, how do we get people to stop and feel the kavanah, the intention of that moment? When you see a synagogue in the distance, you say, Ma tovu oalecha Yaakov. How good, there's a lovely typo. How good are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel? Upon arriving at the synagogue door, stop momentarily to arrange your clothes properly and say, I, through your abundant love, enter your house. And also say it when we come to sit down for Zoom classes or Zoom services. Do we approach our computer? It's not watching a football game, although there's a lot of reverence in a football game. I'll be the first to admit it. But what do we need to have in our environment as we're getting ready to sit for services or classes? What do we wear when you come for services or classes, even if you're watching it on Zoom? That was actually a statement at our board meeting last night, where somebody said people are awfully comfortable coming to services in their pajamas. And it's a challenge, right? I find myself doing that now. I have gotten very comfortable wearing my hiking shoes when I'm on campus, because for months I didn't really see, no one would ever see my shoes. And I've also had knee surgery, so there's a whole shoe issue there. But I'm finding myself now encountering a lot more people in person and in Zoom. And I'm like, well, you know what? It's time to put on the dress shoes again. It's time to put on the tie. It is a different part of the experience. How can we set up these words to remind us as we're moving through time and space when I'm coming into these experiences of synagogue life, that I say, Ma tovu, wait, I'm coming into this holy space. What are the clothes? What are the surroundings I have? I enter with dignity, bowing at the holy ark, and I say, I bow down in awe with your holy temple. You walk a bit and you bend your knees, and I kneel before the eternal one who made me. And then if it's a weekday, I leave some charity for the poor as much as you can afford, saying, here I stand ready, willing to perform the commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. So how do we come not just to watch worship or to watch somebody teach, but how do we engage in that? And how do I turn it into an act of chesed, which is loving kindness, or tzedakah, an act of justice and righteousness? And that really kind of brings us into the class today. How do I not just, oh, I learned something cool in Torah, but, and this will bring us back to the story of Jacob and Israel. How do I let it transform? How do I let it really change how I move through the world? So that's actually one of the questions I have. How does Jacob become Israel? And I look to you all to think about it. How does Jacob, and when does Jacob become Israel? And I give you a great example. How does Peter Parker become Spider-Man? And feel free to unmute. Steve and Sue are shaking their head.
I know how Jacob, I have no idea how Peter Parker did.
Okay, so a bit by God. Yes, thanks, Jake. So we got a wrestling match. Peter Parker becomes a Spider-Man because he gets bitten by a radioactive spider. Jacob, I'm glad, Jake, I hope you know the answer to that question. So Jacob, Yaakov, means my brother and I are twins. My brother was being born before me. I am grabbing him by the ankle to pull him back in so I can be born first. That's what Yaakov means in Genesis. It is quite an incredible name to say, I am born, I am already wrestling with my sibling. I'm already trying to get ahead of my sibling. As a younger brother, and by the way, most of our heroes in Jewish life are younger siblings. Isaac is a younger sibling. Jacob is a younger sibling. Moses is a younger sibling. David is a younger sibling. It's interesting for us who have the oldest of the religions that's around very often, that we are always an underdog story and always a younger sibling story. So Jacob literally means I'm grabbing Esau by the ankle and trying to pull him back in so I can get ahead. And that's actually most of Jacob's story, right? That they have the whole episode with the birthright, that Esau is, I'm so hungry, I'm going to die. And Jacob says, oh, look, I have a pot of stew to give you if you'll sell me the birthright. And then later with the parental blessing as Isaac's about to die, Esau goes out into the field to make an offering for his father. Jacob puts on Esau clothing. He puts himself in sheep's skin and comes in trying to smell and sound like his brother. And he ends up getting the parental blessing from Isaac. And of course, that really pisses off Esau. Esau wants to kill him. And Jacob then hands off Yaakov, the one who's trying to pull his brother back so he can get ahead, ends up going off into the wilderness. And that's actually coming up in a couple of weeks in the Torah portion, and goes off on a 20-year adventure outside of the land of Israel. And he has that dream of the stairway to heaven. That happens as he's heading off into the world. As he is coming back 20 years later, he's got 12 kids. He's got 2 wives and 2 maidservants, and he's got this whole family that's growing, and he's coming back to the land. Esau is coming out to meet him, and he sends everybody else away, and he goes to ready to confront Esau himself. He lays down in a place, and he finds himself wrestling with a guy. Now, a lot of us know that as an angel, but it actually in the text it says an ish, a man. Later tradition then identifies that as an angel as early as the prophets. And Psalms actually talks about it as an angel as well. He wrestles back and forth, and Jacob says, let me go, because dawn is, or the angel says, the other says, let me go, dawn is breaking. Jacob says, bless me first. And the other says something interesting. He says, you're going to be known not as Jacob, the one who pulls your brother back in order to get ahead, but now you're going to become Israel, the one who wrestles with beings divine and human and prevails. And he wrenches Jacob's hip at the socket, dislocating it. Oh. Jacob limps, who still has a little ways to go to become Israel, limps away from that place. And so to me, it's one of my favorite biblical stories, because it's how incredible it is that we are in that process of becoming Israel, the ones who wrestle with beings divine and human and prevail. But it should, if we really wrestle like Jacob, we don't have to pull your hip out of socket. We're not Bo Jackson. But it should physically change how we move through the world. If we're really wrestling with beings divine and human and prevailing, we should still move differently through the world. And that, to me, is what all of this is about. When we're really wrestling with each other, when we're really discussing the text, when we're really trying to connect with the divine, if we learn something, that we're impacted with the text, because it changes how we interact with the world and we interact with each other. And so I offer that to you to be thinking about as we move forward. This kavanah that I show you, when you come into a place, this text of Tovu is one of those that you can use. How do you really come into that space? So, questions so far? Y'all are good. Was that helpful to tell that story?
Yeah.
And that is one of those stories that we need to hear and rehear each year. And it's easy to say, oh, I've heard the story of the wrestling, or I've heard the story of the stairway to heaven, and not really hear that whole story. It's really pretty amazing and incredible. And I'm pretty sure, by the way, Spider-Man was Superman is Moses. They were, a lot of the comic book characters were all generated by Jewish writers, by the way.
Yeah.
Which is a whole phenomenon. That's a whole nother class. So the world stands on 3 things: study, ritual, and acts of loving kindness. You've probably heard this a lot. Ashlosha Devarim, Ashlosha Devarim. There's a reason I'm a rabbi and not a cantor or even cantorial soloist. Jake, do not worry, I'm not coming for your job. So the Al HaTorah, the Al HaAvodah, the Al Gemilut Chasadim. Study, acts, rituals, acts, action that we use to bring, physical action that we use to bring spirituality or emotion, and then Gemilut Chasadim, act of love and kindness. And there's plenty of study that goes with that text there, which I'm assuming is a familiar text, or at least a familiar song. Susan, is that familiar?
I don't know.
Okay. There's also Ashlosha Devarim, Ashlosha Devarim. It's very often sung during the Hakafah when the Torah is being carried around.
Jake?
Which one do you all sing, Jake?
We do Al Shlosha Devarim, Al Shlosha Devarim, Al Shlosha Devarim, Haolam Omed.
Does that sound more familiar?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I sang.
That's exactly, yeah. I was jamming to Rabbi Michael. I was like, yeah, whoa, get it.
I just haven't warmed up my voice yet.
It's dry down here in Florida, I'm telling you.
So it's a base text. It's a beautiful text. And it's just a reminder, these are the three things that we do all the time in Jewish life: study, ritual, and acts of loving kindness. And so as we're thinking about those three things and we're looking at Tovu, how do we catalyze? How do we use that text of Tovu through our study to impact our ritual and to impact our acts of love and kindness? This is also one of these things because we say this in the morning, and I think it's really pretty vital for us as we move through the world. How do we turn our curses into blessings, or how do we turn the blessing of others into a blessing for ourselves? And so that is the whole frame of Tovu. Bil'am is about to curse the people of Israel, and instead out of his mouth comes blessings. How often are we about to kvetch about somebody or complain about somebody or criticize somebody? And instead, how do we find our way of saying, wait a second, am I being too harsh? Am I being cruel? Am I being too critical? Do I need to look at that in a different way? Or Bil'am blesses the people of Israel. And here we are thousands of years later looking at his words. How do we take his words of blessing to the people then and there into blessings here and now? It's a really interesting way of thinking about both of those. Are two very different ways of thinking about that text. How does it give us leverage, or how does it give us tools? How does it give us that moment where we're moving through our day and we pause and say, oh, wait a second, that's a Tovu moment. I'm about to be negative here. How can I make it positive? Or here's somebody, you know what? Somebody just did something nice. Somebody brought blessing in the world. How do I take that and find ways to make that into a blessing I can offer? So here is one kind of commentary that comes from that story. It's a Talmudic tale of the rude rabbi or the ugly man. And the story borrows its plot and principal players from that of Bil'am. Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon, riding atop his donkey on the way home from a Torah study conference, returns the respectful greeting of a total stranger by calling him ugly. Okay, so like Bil'am, Elazar is riding on Elazar ben Shimon is riding on a donkey. And the donkey is the one that seems to have wisdom and not the rabbi who's riding on the donkey. And he calls out with a curse, cursing a guy and telling him, you're ugly. The ugly man calls out to the rabbi, replying, go complain to the craftsman who made me. So who's the craftsman that made him?
God.
It's God, right? So if you're going to tell me I'm ugly, go complain to God about how ugly I am, right? Kind of that same thing that the donkey's like, look, I've been getting you here this whole time, and now you're going to sit here and beat me. I've been trying to protect you the whole time. Here you have the person that supposedly is ugly is reminding Elazar of a higher value. I mean, is it the ugliness of how we look, or is it the ugliness of how we sound? Okay. The rude rabbi offers an apology, but the man refuses to accept it until the rabbi actually files his complaint. Okay. So be really careful about the criticism you offer or the curse that you offer, because if you really offer it, it's just listening to a whole thing about social media, how amazing it would be before people write nastiness on Facebook or Instagram or a comment at the end of an article, if they thought about, wait a second, this is just another human being. I'm sitting here about to curse another human being. Why do I need to put that into the world? Right? If I had to walk around, man, wow. If I had to walk around with a shirt listing the number of times I said something nasty under my breath, behind the scenes, if that was on display, right? On what do they have on social media? On social media, you get the number of thumbs up or thumbs down. What if every time I walked around, people got to see how negative or positive I was, right? And I feel like that's kind of the challenge here. Before you actually, you apologize to me, well, go take your complaint to God, right? Are you really going to complain to God about how God made me? I am who I am. You know, think about what you're really criticizing here, okay? The rabbi follows the man to town and ends up preaching about flexibility at Temple Beth Ugly Town. Rabbi Elazar's repentance is celebrated for as long as the Jews study Talmud. Okay, so here's that a Talmudic story about about flexibility and who are you really cursing? How are we cursing? And the ugly man's granting pardon is repaid with endless anonymity, both for himself and his hometown. Okay. Susan, you're making a face because you're trying to wrap your mind around that.
Exactly. I don't, I mean, first of all, why would you just call somebody ugly? I mean, you're just two strangers walking by. Why did the rabbi, who's supposed to be a respected person that everyone turns to, why would he do that? And to offer an apology, that's just weak, probably. And then he preaches at Temple Beth Ugly Town. So he's still bringing the word in. So I'm sorry. I can't follow.
And yet, how many times have I heard someone make a comment about my hair, my clothing, my weight, my ability to sing or lack thereof, right?
Oh, well, you're a public figure. Yeah. You're a public figure.
But people, and I brought up social media, yeah. but it happens all the time.
Oh yeah. People
say all kinds of stuff.
That's true.
And here's that kind of challenge of, wait, who are you when you're uttering that curse or you're saying something to someone, who are you really insulting? What does it say more about the person you're talking about, or does it say more about you? And I think sometimes we don't even realize, and Sheldon's on the chat is saying part of being Jewish, accepting flaws in the best of people. Absolutely. How many times have I sat in a presentation service and I've gotten kind of grumpy because it didn't sound like I wanted it to sound, or that's not how I would have taught it, or I can't believe how long they're going on and on. I've done it too, right? That's just part of, and this is that chance. When you say Ma Tovu, it's that chance to say, wait a second, am I being Bilam or am I being the donkey? Right? I'm going to take it a little bit further. Rabban Gamliel, who presided over the academy at Yavne, decreed that any student whose inside is not like his outside might not enter a house of study. Okay. And then the question gets asked, who would be more likely to pass a litmus test, Bilam or his donkey? Right? The rude rabbi or the ugly man? It's a real challenge. How do we really talk about that or think about what Rabban Gamliel is saying? And there's other teaching that goes there too, because we don't actually keep anybody, we want to do everything we can not to have anybody not be able to come in. But at the same time, we have to check ourselves. And is my outside reflecting my inside? Is my inside reflecting my outside? Right? Who am I walking into study? Am I being the person? An ugly man is an interesting one, right? Because you don't want to be disheveled. You do want to come in. That it's a challenge for us because we do see people come into the sanctuary and they're not showing respect with their clothing, might not be showing respect to the sanctuary. So what's the balance of those two kinds of things? So here, neither Balak or the king of Moab, nor Moses or Israelites are aware that the man pronouncing such beautiful words of blessing is the same person who bathed so badly just a chapter ago. For them, the words of speech are untainted by the deeds of the speaker, not so for us. Those privy to the incident could be troubled by widely different aspects of that same person. There we are, and you're sitting there saying Ma Tovu, and it's like, oh, blessing for the people of Israel. But wait, do I really want to accept that blessing, right? Because that just came out of Bilam, who's a prophet who had a donkey that had more vision than he is, and he was ready to, until God laid down the boom, was ready to curse the people of Israel. And so at what point do we say, it's both a challenge to us, as it's a challenge to us as a speaker, and it's a challenge to us as a listener. At what point do you listen to the words, and at what point do you hear who it's coming from? Okay, just another way of wrestling with this. There are a lot of, by the way, tons of facets to this, and not everyone do you have to be thinking about all of the time. So Jake, what you're saying, the difference between one's words and actions, you can speak more to that.
Yeah, so when it talks about whose inside is not like the outside, it's almost like how people act versus what they say. Like you get some people sometimes on these platforms saying they're all this and I affect people in this way. And especially when they're talking about the charity that they give to people versus what people just do without expecting any sort of recognition for it, or they do without expecting other people to find out. So it's sort of like the inside versus the outside type of thing.
And we've been actually having a whole discussion of Rambam's ladder. And so there's actually a whole different one, because sometimes people have to be able to see the good that's being going on because it's infectious. Great example of all of that is Lance Armstrong. Right? Do we all remember Livestrong?
Oh, yeah.
And there's an interesting one, because do you allow, the other one was it 3 cups of tea? It was the pennies for peace. I feel like it was 3 cups of tea, but the guy, it was I'm pretty sure it was 3 cups of tea. It was in Afghanistan, and it was a guy who was creating a whole program. And then it came out that a lot of his memoir wasn't really true. It was the story he was telling about himself.
That's not Matt Lauer.
Matt Lauer's another, it was not Matt Lauer.
That made me think of Matt Lauer.
So there you've got rude rabbi or ugly man, right? And so it's, how do you navigate all of those kinds of things? Do you listen to the words, or do you listen to the person? And what happens if you have somebody who delivers the words that has some ugliness around them, or that you have somebody that relies on their looks for them to get heard? All sorts of rather incredible dynamics with this. I'm going to, Rabbi Joseph Adelheit, who was a classmate of my dad's, has actually taught for us here, reminds us of the debate about what to do with great works by disgraced individuals has always been painful, can never be resolved satisfactorily. He describes a poignant scene in Yochi Brandis's novel, The Orchard, in which the Talmudic sages, here's a great one. What do you do with the Songs of King David? Should they be excised, considering the sins of adultery and murder?
That's interesting.
We use, isn't that one mind-blowing? We use the Psalms all the time.
What about Shlomo Carlsbach?
What was that, Sue?
What about Rabbi Shlomo Carlsbach?
That is absolutely part of this discussion. So Jake is asking the question if David really wrote the Psalms. Sue, you're bringing up the question of what happens when we find out that a melody that is very powerful or a teaching that is very meaningful is coming from a human being that did a lot of damage in our world, right? How do you separate the blessing from the person who delivers the blessing? And it is a huge, huge challenge. Susan's really now thinking this one through.
I am, because I'm somebody that would be fast to say back in those days, delete, delete, delete. I mean, he's a bad man. We shouldn't be, raising him up, and we would be missing something beautiful and wonderful had they, decided to excise them. And I can't weigh it out.
Well, that is exactly what we're doing. You're weighing it out. And also, at what point do you have to do this has actually come up with some of the Disney movies, that they have a statement at the beginning talking about issues of sexism or racism or xenophobia that are in older Disney movies. How often do you put the warning label? How when we're watching Snow White, at what point do we see it for what it is, or how much do we bring up some of the problematic issues that are in it?
And Christopher Columbus Day. I mean, we would not be here as a country had he not found us. But on the other hand, he destroyed the indigenous people by introducing, white people.
Here's another different piece of this. Is Fiddler on the Roof a tragedy or a comedy? Or a story of success? Is Fiddler on the Roof a tragedy or success? And Stephen, so you can unmute.
Yeah, I would say it's both.
Great Jewish answer. Because I'm sitting there, you watch the end and they're leaving on a tefka, and it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is.
But then you think about it, because if they hadn't left on a tefka, what happens 30 years later or 40 years later? They would have all been wiped out by the Holocaust. And so as we're thinking about Ma Tovu, it's a great way when you wake up in the morning, really thinking about the blessing and the curses, right? Really thinking about how do we offer blessing, who is doing that blessing for us. Sheldon's bringing up the destruction of the temple. And here, I'll go all Star Warsy on you, as Obi-Wan would say, from a certain point of view, right? Because on one way, we have the Judaism we have because of the destruction of the temple. I'm guessing the generation that witnessed the destruction of the temple and its aftermath wouldn't have such a positive view about it. And it's just, that's that text, right? Are we the donkey or are we Bil'am? When are we having our eyes closed or when are we having our eyes open? Okay, I'm gonna keep going with this.
Okay.
So this is from last week's Torah portion. Got to remember which week I'm on here. This is last week's Torah portion. This is what God says to Abraham when he goes forth. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him that curses you. All the families of the earth shall themselves be by you. And remember that when we first started our lesson, I showed a lot of places in the Bil'am story where it was resonances with Abraham experiences, to the fact that he slept on it. He got the instructions and slept on it, that he was riding a donkey, that he had 2 servants with him. There were a number of places that were really filled with a lot of resonance between Abraham and Bil'am. And here you get that same issue of blessing and cursing. Okay. So in that place, you actually get some interesting commentary that helps us get into that discussion of blessing and cursing. Lest Abraham be intimidated by God's summons. So God had to sweeten it for Abraham, reassuring him that his admirers will be many and his detractors will be few. Why would anyone curse or hate Abraham, who is setting out to serve God in all humanity? And the fact is, there have always been individuals in society that resent God's strenuous moral demands and direct their resentments towards those who strive to live up to them. Or going back to our discussion that we had just a moment ago, art, music, writing, teaching comes from human beings. Since there are no perfect human beings, even if we have something that is beautiful and wonderful, that human being is going to have flaws. You can't expect them to be perfect. It's that challenge is, what is the threshold? Right? So here, you're always, yes, you're going to have people that are always going to be negative. How do we give Abraham enough koach, so as he goes off into the world, he's not pulled down too far by his detractors? All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. And history's borne out the validity of Hirsch's comments. So this is Samson Raphael Hirsch, late 19th, early 20th century, modern Orthodox commentator, I believe in the United States. I will bless each nation in accordance with the respect it shows the Jewish spirit. Nations and empires that have treated the Jews well, from Muslim Spain to the United States, they flourished, owing to the large measure of their openness to many peoples and their specific contributions to Jewish citizens. Nations that began persecuting Jews out of their hatred for Jewish morals have gone on to bring the destruction on themselves and the surroundings, right? Going back to the story of Bil'am, what is Balak trying to do? Balak is trying to curse the people of Israel. He's worried that the people of Israel are going to destroy him. By bringing in Bil'am to curse the people of Israel, he ends up undermining himself. And we see this in history. It's really pretty incredible that we see it in history. The golden age of Spain was amazing because the Muslim community there said there are things that we can gain from the Christians, from the Jews and the Muslims. Let's all have a big party together. Art, science, math, astronomy, poetry was all blowing up and coming from all different places in Muslim Spain. And then you get the Inquisition. The Inquisition, let's begin, which is from a Mel Brooks, that song's from a Mel Brooks movie, History of the World. But as soon as the Inquisition says, no, there are There's a way to do things. There's only one way to do things. We don't want this intermixing. And those people are trying to destroy us. They start cursing other people. That whole sense of Spain starts to collapse, right? And Susan, you brought forward Columbus. In 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Ferdinand and Isabella said Spain shouldn't have a single Jew. And it was, yeah, that's, by the way, that last part is my addition to it. But 1492 is the expulsion of Jews from Spain just as Columbus is sailing. And there's actually a lot of commentary that, in fact, some of Columbus's crew might have been Jews that were running. Columbus probably wasn't. The information I've seen said Columbus probably wasn't, but there were probably either crypto Jews or converted Jews that were on those boats. But that starts leading up to the kind of the fall of Spain, even as moving from its golden ages. And we can even see this in some place when the United States says, let us be not a melting pot, but an incredible place where we're seeing this diversity. You get amazing things that happen in this country from immigrants, from people from different cultures, different contributions in math, science, art, food, all sorts of different things. And the more we say we don't want anything that's different, we put those blinders on, it starts the community starts to collapse.
Okay.
Different commentary. Bilam is a good model for prayer. He came to curse Israel, and in the end, upon observing Israel's places of worship, blessed her. If through the involvement of the worship of community, negative feelings can be transmuted into positive ones, is it not their hope for us who are being far from blaspheming should not be that much closer to blessing? Okay, so shifting from that blessing and cursing, and how do we move through the world, and how are we accepted in the world with blessing and curses? This is a personal piece of value. I'm sitting there in the morning, I'm having a bad day. I say the words of Bilam, I remember that story, and I'm like, wait a second, why am I bringing curses in the world? Let me bring blessing. And if does singing, and we'll next week, by the way, we're going to feature our very own cantorial soloist Jake Harris. Jake and I are talking about different musical settings, different musical settings for Tovu, but maybe there's something in the power of bringing that prayer that helps us engage a different sense of our spirit. The technical term is to turn your frown upside down.
Technical.
Here's a different, another one more last piece. We know the conditions in the desert must have been difficult. Nevertheless, Israel was able to ensure that every family had their own space, a place that was theirs. It is enlightening to contrast this with the modern conditions of poverty in the United States. The U.S. government, claiming to respond to the demands of the people, has made it more and more difficult for the poor to live in a decent place. Rashi's comment strikes deeply to the heart of what it is meant to have a good place to live. The people of Israel were moving forward towards their own land, and though not yet there, they made a community. Homes created an atmosphere of respect from one another. Just as in every community, there are those who are richer and those who are poorer. Every family in Israel is a space in which to live, a place to be respectable and respected. And from these homes, they were able to envision a brighter future, one in their own land, which they could not build with their own hands to improve both themselves, it and themselves. The decency of their homes was the base for which they built their future. So this is an economic piece of value applying Tovu. And remember, I will be the first to say, these are different ways of applying this text and living it out. Not everyone is going to speak to every person all of the time. It might be that some of these speak to you in to different people, and some of different moments that they speak to you. And this is one of those pieces that is that challenge. And remember, what was that last piece, that when you walk into the house of worship, do an act of giving of tzedakah. Here's that saying, you know what? am walking in, I'm thinking about the people of Israel going into God's house. And that was all a reflection of Bilam seeing the people of Israel living in dignity with their house. How can I move in my congregation in a way that can bring more people dignity? Is there some part of my congregation and communities I'm thinking in prayer where I can contribute that gives somebody a sense of dignity and in their own house? Okay. And Jake is throwing out minimum wage versus the cost of living dilemma, right? That you have, how do you have the ability for companies to earn money, but also if their workers don't have a place to live, then they can't actually have the workers to sustain them. All kinds of different discussions. This one text, do you see all of the different facets of this one text that it can bring? Really kind of, it's kind of beautiful and astonishing, different ways to, one instrument, one text, and it has so many different pieces to offer to us. So I'm actually going to stop the screen share at this moment. And I'm bringing it over so I can actually look. Just kind of questions, thoughts. And as I said, next week, what we're going to do is look at this as a piece of music and a piece of liturgy, because that actually has a whole different way of engaging us. Curious of which of these do you like, of these different commentaries or ways that you really like?
After all this, that last one that you read, where everybody is respected, you're given the house. It doesn't matter what it is, but you're given the opportunity to improve yourself and be respected and respect. And that's going to stick with me.
And it becomes a mission of Israel. Wait, if Bilam saw us and that was part of his blessing, what do we do as a community to make sure that happens again?
I'm still not sure about that ugly man thing.
It is a huge challenge.
A horrible
and
man.
it's both of that as we share works from other people, but also as we move through the world, how do we make sure that we're not being the rude rabbi?
Right.
Or
right.
that we're walking around that the way we present ourselves turns people off either.
Yeah.
Sheldon, is there a part of that some of the different stuff I'm teaching that catches your attention?
I can't hear.
Sheldon, you're muted.
I think practically all of it is catching my attention. I think there's certainly shades of gray. None of this is black and white. There are certainly shades of gray. Certainly we should provide opportunities, and certainly, on the other hand, there are people who will not accept the mores of society, and those mores should not be changed to accommodate those people.
Yeah.
We have to keep in mind that if you look at every Jewish family in America, I bet if you go back 2 or 3 generations, in every reasonably affluent Jewish family in America, you will find that there were people who were actually poor.
Yes.
People who grew up without their own bedrooms.
Yes. Yes.
And yet these people achieved. And when you talk about providing a place for people, well, I'm sorry, Susan, but the first thing that popped into my head for whatever reason was the Cabrini Green housing project in Chicago. That ended up being, it provided a place for all the poor people to live in a dignified manner, and it ended up being razed to the ground.
Yeah, that's right. They didn't respect their surroundings.
Mm-hmm.
And so
it's a two-way street.
And that is, that's one of those things that Bilam sees a perfect image of the community of Israel. And yet we also know that the people of Israel, as they were encamped in the wilderness, were having fights with each other left and right, and fighting with God and fighting with Moses. And yet our image of it is, or the image that Bilam has, is this very this serene and perfect place. I mean, there's a wonderful one as we're looking at social media. All you're getting is the Bilam snapshot of somebody's life. You're not actually getting a chance to see all of the stuff behind the scenes. And so be careful about your blessing and praising of how somebody beautiful somebody might look or perfect might look on camera, not realizing what might be below the surface. So yeah, we are coming up to one, and just all sorts of different layers of this. And I hope you will join Jake and I next week, because we're gonna look into the music. Bring your friends. Jake will be singing, I promise, not me.
Well, then, okay.
That was absolutely wonderful and so inspiring on Ma Tovu, and I think I'm gonna be able to sing it that much better next week because we've been enlightened in these ways. So thank you so much, Rabbi Michael. This is fantastic. Hope to see you all next week.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
And you too. Go to your garden.